Welcome to Free Lunch Podcast. I am your host. I'm actually one half of the Free Lunch Podcast duo today. BG couldn't join us, but this is a very exciting, impromptu, exclusive interview for those that follow Free Lunch Podcast and for those that tune in weekly. Uh, you know the story. You know that I am a direct descendant uh, of those that were on the slave ship, the Clotilda, and you all have followed the numerous interviews we've had. And for those that have been following the breaking news, there have been remains of the Clotilda, the vessel that delivered the last known cargo of Africans into slavery in the United States, has been remains have been found. And so we previously had Mr. James Delgado, Senior Vice President of Search Inc., on the call. And it was actually almost about 10 months ago or so since he was on the show and kind of gave us some insight into some of the searching they had been doing in the Mobile River Bay area. And so today, um, we have Jim back on the show. Really, this is exciting news, breaking news around, and for him to share with us some of the things that have taken place over the past few hours. So Jim, I'd like to welcome you to the Free Lunch Podcast show and to our viewership. First off, thank you for agreeing to do this spontaneously. This was something that you and I have been in contact via email throughout the year, and you've held your promise of saying that you would come back on this show. And I want to just personally thank you in front of our audience for being a man of honor and uh, adhering to what you said you would do. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. No, thank you. It's an honor and a privilege, particularly to be sharing this with somebody whose family is so powerfully tied to this story. And with that, I think all of us who have worked on this, and it's a very big team, um, everybody knew exactly what this was about and why it needed to be done. It was done for the people of Africa Town and for the descendants and for those who came on that ship because stories are powerful and they can be there for families, they can be there in the larger community. But when something's discovered, when it is tangibly there, and while suspected that it may be there or thought that it has survived in some way, when you actually have it there, I think it creates a powerful new connection. And as we're seeing today, as the news has gone out, it's connecting all over the world because now we have not just remains, Jeremy. We have pretty much a fair amount of Clotilda.
That's exciting to hear. Few questions. And I want to ask this question. I asked you via email, but just for the sake of for our listeners, uh, how confident are you that you've located the Clotilda based on your experience, and you have over 40 years of experience, and with the history and the research that you've done for the pieces of the ship that you've identified? How confident are you that it's the Clotilda?
Well, 40 years does make me sound about as old as I am, but here we go. As we said in the press release, and as some of the stories have come out, uh, people always ask, is there a percentage? And the point is, I don't think I can answer in terms of a percentage. We've said it's likely Clotilda, and that's scientific speak for you can never, with any precision, say exactly, unless I think you're dealing with a certain mathematical formula or things of that sort. You can if you've got a ship and the name is on it. But even after Titanic was discovered, there were some people that were suggesting it was a conspiracy and that Titanic had been replaced with its sister ship. So back to Clotilda. We haven't found, nor did we expect to find, anything that had a name on it. There was no bell that was left on it, as we know, and nothing else that's been seen to date that says Clotilda or has the name Foster or anybody that was on board the ship. However, what you do in a case like this, in a scientist, is we look at everything that is known, and then we take that and we test that against that which we see. And we do that not to try to prove that it is. We actually take it from the opposite end to prove that it's not, because you don't want to carry that bias forward in your science. Like, I got to prove this, as opposed to let's critically test this. And in the end, we could not find anything in everything we looked at that said it wasn't. In fact, everything we looked at said it was. It's not only the right size, it's the right shape. And by that, one of the critical things we discovered is that originally we thought Clotilda was, like any vehicle. You use a car to commit a crime, and you take it and you burn it in a back lot. Well, when Clotilda was used to commit a crime and bringing your ancestors over from Africa to enslave them, they burned it. And so, with that, we're saying, okay, am I looking at your average 1960 Chevy that's burned in a back lot? And in the case of Clotilda, am I looking for just any average schooner built in the Gulf of Mexico in this period that's burned? How will we tell it apart from others? Well, that's where the science, particularly with archaeology of the more recent past, looks at records. And while not every record is there, we had things that had been written down. And so the first thing that happened was actually going and pulling all of the original documents. We didn't rely on a book. We didn't rely on a story that had been published in a newspaper years later, even if it was an interview with somebody, where we had actual written notes. Captain Foster had written notes talking about what he had done. He had written a narrative. There were the court documents, and we pulled and looked at everything, what was said, what had been recorded. We also looked at every original record for every schooner built or registered to work in the Gulf of Mexico that had operated out of New Orleans or Mobile from 1818 to 1890. So that was over 1,500 schooners. So coming back to this point,
Yes.
when you look at it, you say, okay, you start patterns emerge. Out of those 1,500, about half of them were built elsewhere. They're built up north. They're built on the Great Lakes, and they're coming down and they're working in the Gulf. And what makes them stand out is they're bigger ships built in the Yankee North that can carry more cargo. They're big, deep holds that can carry many tons of cargo. And that is different than the locally built boats, which are generally, they may be the same size, but they've got very small holds that don't carry as many tons because they're largely working in the local trade in very shallow bays like Mobile Bay. You can't have a ship that's big and deep, it's going to get stuck in the mud. But you do have ships like this that'll work in and out and will connect you to deep water ports. And so we said, okay, with that, we come up with what is basically the average size of schooners in the Gulf, and then the average size of schooners in the Gulf that are built in the Gulf. And Clotilda stood out. It's like, wow, it's not bigger, but it carries more. That means it's a deeper hold. It's built like the ships up north, but it's also built with a flatter bottom that lifts it up out of the water more, so it can work in the shallow waters. And like some of these ships, because it rides up so high, it needs to balance itself. So they put in what's called a centerboard or a drop keel that once you get out of the shallows, it slots and swings on down, and now you can sail in deeper water. Now I realize I'm getting into ship nerd land here with this, but
It's
with all of this,
interesting. Hmm.
yeah. So with this, we suddenly realized, wow, Clotilda isn't a 1960 Chevy. It's not even a DeLorean. And now I'm aging myself. It's a custom built car.
Hmm.
And when we looked further, what we found was these guys had built it in Mobile originally to do deep water trade. They're from the north. The guy that built it, Foster himself, is from Nova Scotia, and he comes from a
Correct.
shipbuilding family and had been building ships for years. So he builds a ship like that that perfectly suited to the local conditions, but can work in the deep water, and it's built there by these guys to take on the financial interests in New York and elsewhere. They're going to do it on their own, and this ship is built as it's launched to go into the Texas trade, which means it can carry a lot of things. It can carry 120 tons of cargo, whereas most of the Gulf-built schooners are carrying between 40 to 60 tons of cargo. It can carry a lot of lumber. It can carry other things. And it's built to sail down to the mouth of the Brazos River, where Texas is beginning to build up after the Texas Revolution. It's sailing to Mexico. It's sailing to Cuba. What it's carrying is lumber cut in Mobile so that these guys can compete, and they come back with other goods. And we then went and looked at all of the records and could see that Clotilda had worked on at least 40 different voyages doing all of this. And so a pattern emerged. And with that, something else stood out. And that was that at every step and stage of this career between 1855 and 1860, while Clotilda was not engaged in the slave trade, the activities it was participating in and the trade that it was carrying on was both made possible by and continued to support slavery, because the ports it was going to, and particularly in Cuba, were bringing lumber to build sugar boxes where the enslaved were in plantations working. The need for enslaved people there had kept the illegal slave trade going there. And so it was clear to us that as they're sailing in and out, while we may have not been standing on the deck or seeing it, these guys are seeing ships coming in defiance of the ban on the slave trade and bringing people into Cuba. They're seeing it happen in Mexico when they sail to Tampico, which is another port. And they see it happening as people are being smuggled into Texas. And I think that may have been part of the germ of the idea. But as well, it just reminds us that at this stage, what this ship is doing, what it's participating in, is all in support of a system that is powerfully fueled by enslaved labor that allows these people to make incredible profits by not paying people for their work. And the entire country's hooked on it. That's why guys from the North, like Foster and Mayer, came down to Mobile in the first place, to take advantage of the boom in the cotton trade, and then further in these other areas. Enslaved people worked in the shipyards and likely helped build Clotilda. Enslaved people loaded. Enslaved people were on the waters. And in one voyage coming back in, Clotilda ran down a vessel and killed an enslaved man. So
Hmm.
while Clotilda's remembered for its final voyage and what it did, we can never forget that from the start, it represents this aspect of the history. So I realize I've gone off on a tangent. Let me just come back and
No,
say,
no, no. This has been. I've allowed. This is a podcast, so
yeah,
we'll
okay,
allow you to speak and share kind of your story and your thoughts. So I didn't interrupt intentionally. So
no, it's all
continue.
good.
Hmm. Hmm.
So with that, with all of these original records and the original written words of Foster in particular, things begin to emerge. And so one of those is that Clotilda is unique. And with that, the vessel that is down there is unique. It not only is the right size, but it's the right shape. And when you look at all that and you calculate how many tons it can carry using the formulas they did back then, we came up with, oh, it's right up there. It's that. In other words, there were only 5 schooners built in the Gulf in that period that were of a certain size, and only one of them was exactly that size and form, and that was Clotilda. And so when you find a wreck that's largely intact, burned and damaged, but just the same, it's to that form and shape and tonnage, you go, okay. So then you look at other things. The vessel, the wreck, when we started looking at it, had areas, and I just want to stop and say, this is working in a river at flood stage with freezing water, particularly in the winter.
Hmm.
which is good because that kept the snakes and the gators at a distance, and they're there. Um,
Yes.
we had one in particular that loved to come and check it out. But you also have water that has so much silt in it you cannot see your hand in front of your face. And so oftentimes we'd see something loose, we'd raise it and look at it. And what we saw was a ship that had been exquisitely built, as finely built as a yacht might be. And with that, we began to realize, wow, if this is Clotilda, then this really does show the work of a series of people who really knew what they were doing, or a master craftsman. It, they didn't cut corners, and everything was perfectly done down to the point where a plank alongside the hull, ordinarily that would just be fastened with spikes driven into it, they countersunk the spikes and then covered the heads with wooden plugs. And those wooden plugs were placed in the right way so that the grain of the plug matched the grain of the plank that had been cut out of it.
Oh wow.
That kind of attention to detail is like, well, okay, I see this. This isn't something a bunch of guys just built on the mud flats outside their place. This came out of a shipyard, and this came with somebody who really knew how to build a ship. So that we had that. Then we also knew, because Clotilda had been insured and had been built to a higher standard to get insurance, that the wood used in the construction exactly matched what the insurance record said. The ribs or the frames were white oak, the planks were southern pine, and the metal was iron. And when we analyzed it, well, I should say when National Geographic analyzed it in the laboratory, it came back as pure pig iron. And that told us that this had been done before 1870, when they really started shifting to steel. But also, the fasteners had been shaped by a blacksmith working by hand, and most likely, out of that yard, an enslaved person. The other part was the ship had a centerboard, and we found the remains of that. We found part of the ship's pump, and we also found that the hull had been covered in copper to protect it, something we knew Clotilda had. And while the copper was gone, the line of nails showed exactly where it had been at the edge, and we actually found one of those nails with the head broken off still inside the plank. So all of that matched up, and at this point, it's like, wow, it really is looking like it, but where's the smoking gun? Well, we didn't get a smoking gun, but what we got was something that clearly showed that there'd been a fire. Pieces started to come up with bent metal and with wood sticking to them that looked as if you'd speared a charcoal briquette. We looked at that and we said, this isn't erosion. This isn't marine organisms eating this. These things are perfectly smooth, and they still have bits of charcoal and pitting. So we went to a forensic fire investigator, Captain Robbie Stevens, who looks at this for criminal prosecutions and court cases and the rest. Went through all the evidence, and he came back and said this. It looked to him that it had indeed burned. And as we kept looking and finding more samples, it became clear that we are looking at a vessel that had been burned, just as Foster had said. But also, a note in Foster's handwriting talked about the fact that at the end of the voyage, when he transferred the people off of Clotilda and onto the steamer Czar to take them up the river to enslavement, I then took my schooner and burned her and sank it in 20 feet of water. Well, the wreck is at its deepest point in 20 feet of water and its shallow as 5. And it's in a more or less direct line from the spot, just a little better than a mile from where Foster said he transferred the people. So, with all of that, as well as even more documentary work, looking at old maps, seeing what had happened, where the river had changed, all of this, what it ultimately boiled down to is we had piece after piece of evidence that crossed the bar, if you will, to use a maritime term. It was beyond a reasonable doubt. And so with that, we said, this has got to be it. But then we took all of that work, wrote it up, and we sent it out to 6 independent scholars for a critical peer review. And they all came back and said, yes, they agreed with the conclusion. And I like that one of them wrote, because he he pretty much called it out colloquially at the end. In his email sending his report back, he said, "If it looks like a duck," and we all smiled. The story is, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, well, then it must be a duck. And so we laughed at the colloquialism, and it was his way of saying, you might not even want to use the word likely, but we're still using the word likely. But having said that, our report to the Alabama Historical Commission and National Geographic and the Slave Rex Project says, while we say likely, treat this as Clotilda. Because I personally, setting aside the scientist for a second, I believe this is Clotilda, and many other people do too. And I think the evidence very powerfully points to that. Now, more work needs to be done, and we can talk a bit about that. But ultimately, at the end of our report, we say for all of the searching that's happened, in the end, we believe that at the time when this happened, it was not really a secret. Everybody in the system there was in on it or knew about it. And in the end, it wasn't burned to destroy the evidence per se. It was burned to get it out of sight where nobody would particularly reasonably go. And the fact that it was always said to be in or around that area was always sort of a nod and a wink. Basically, I think they hid Clotilda in what would be plain sight for them, but not for anybody else.
You said a lot, and I have just one other question around the confidence piece here. What would you say to critics that try to say that this is a conspiracy theorist, or years down the road that try to rebuttal the material and information that you just shared on this podcast, the story? What would you say to them?
Well, science is always evolving, and people can always go back and take a look at it. And we're releasing the report with the Alabama Historical Commission next week, and people can look at that and
That's
do
great.
their own review and examine it. But to that end, we're saying if people want something more definitive, and because more work needs to be done, we're recommending that more work happen because the ship is it's not in perfect shape. It's been burned and it has been dynamited at some stage in its history. There are planks that are thrust up and that are broken.
I will
Some of them are.
follow
I'm sorry, Jeremy.
one of my. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I was saying that I'm extremely interested in the report, and I'm extremely interested. If you remember when I first met you, that was one of the questions I posed about just seeing the report. So I'm extremely excited just to be able to read and follow the history of all the excellent work that you and your team and partners did. I know we're approaching time. I have a few other questions.
Sure.
Has been discovered.
I'm sorry, Jeremy. We just cut out for a second. I didn't hear that.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was asking how much of the ship has been discovered. How much of the ship have you all discovered?
The ship seems intact up to the waterline and past that in some areas. So there's a fair amount of it there. Most of it is buried in mud and it's filled with trees and mud and broken timbers from having been dynamited at some stage. So more work has to be done, but it has to be done carefully because it's a very dangerous site to work on. With that, I would say that digging inside is going to find many other traces. And if that mud is deeply in there, I think we will see more evidence of that final voyage that could be preserved. And who knows what we will find? And therein lies the power of archaeology. It's not just going to be how much of the ship, for me, it's going to be what's lying in there. Because if they merely took people off and then took it up and burned it, then where people ate, where they sat, where they rested, where they were locked away for 4 months. That's going to be very powerfully there and potentially sealed in the mud. What if somebody wrote or scratched their name into the planks on the side, thinking that that might be the only record they left? And what if that's there and could be found? What if there are a set of manacles down there for somebody they were trying to control? What if the tubs of which these guys made the large amounts of food that they fed the people? What if the casks with the water are there? Who knows? We might find more of a more or less, I wouldn't say frozen, but sealed in mud moment in time that will very powerfully evoke even more of a sense of what that voyage on Clotilda was like.
From your experience and from previous explorations, what's the likelihood that any DNA could be found on the woods or from the remains of the ship?
Um, it's possible. National Geographic has been looking into that. At this stage, we're still waiting for initial results to see if any traces that can be attributed to human DNA are found in the mud or in the wood samples that we recovered from inside the hull. After that, then one can look and see if that could be traced further. That has not always been the case with sites underwater, and yet we do know recently there was an excavation up in Maryland where a pipe excavated from the house of an enslaved woman actually retained traces of her DNA. So you
Hmm.
never know, and that's part of the excitement in the field is that real people were caught up in all of this, and they can speak even without words through things like this. And so,
Hmm.
who knows? Who
Hmm.
knows what we might find? And that comes back to why we do this.
Hmm.
We do this because archaeology really shouldn't be just about famous people, famous sites, big names, the powerful in the past. It should be what the reality is of everyday life for all sorts of people and people who in the past were not allowed to speak or ignored. And so archaeology increasingly has looked at things like the lives of the enslaved. It's looked at the lives of women and children. It's looked at people that have been institutionalized. It's looked at the poor. It's looked at immigrant populations. It's examined all of that because that is the reality of history.
Jim, you mentioned, and I know we're approaching our agreed upon time, so I have just a few more questions. You mentioned you've given countless interviews since this news is broke from the press release. Uh, how is this story resonating around the globe, and what are you hearing, or how powerful has this story been over the past few hours, days that this story has been released to the world essentially?
Well, the story came out last night immediately after the Alabama Historical Commission met with the Africatown community to tell them first. That had also been a promise. And as well, I'm looking forward to seeing everybody in Africatown next week because we have a follow up and the actual press conference and the announcement on Thursday, and where the report will be released. I promised everybody, as you may recall, that we'd keep at this and leave as best we could, no stone unturned. And well, I just want to come back and say that we were able to do that thanks to so many people working on this. And to that, so many people working on this, what that has resulted is in so many people responding. The story is spread around the world. We're seeing it in the news in China. We're seeing it on the BBC. We're seeing it elsewhere. We're seeing it all over the country. And now we're seeing it, thanks to the Associated Press, in every town that has a newspaper in America. And with that, we also see things like a powerful video that National Geographic put out with the other parts of the story that talks about what this means to the descendants that they interviewed. And it starts and closes. Most of it is about Africatown and the people and what Africatown means, what it has gone through, and how finding the ship would be something. And it closes with some text saying, and now. And with that, I'll tell you what it really meant to me is that it was one of those moments where you go, yes,
Absolutely,
properly.
absolutely.
This has always been for me about Africa Town and for the people of Africa Town. And so it's, you know, I feel humbled and I feel somewhat emotional about it because I feel that opportunities to touch history, but to do so for the right reasons, for sharing a history and for doing something like this, um, doesn't always come. And so with that, um, it it's a powerful reminder for me of why I got into this 47 years ago, but also why it counts. And when people like the folks in Africa Town say that it does, then that's all that you ever would ask for. So I'll just close by saying people have asked, ultimately, well, you guys found Clotilda? And my answer has been no, we did not find Clotilda. Different people working together, responding to the powerful memories and the stories of Africa Town, spurred by Ben Rain's discovery, and with Ben continuing to be there as a piece of it, but with so many others joining in, combined forces. National Geographic poured incredible resources into it. Our company poured an incredible amount of resources into it and contributed heavily to the cause because we believe this has never been about a job. This is about doing something right. Alabama Historical Commission, too. And so, with that, it really did take a fair amount of teamwork and a lot of people working and volunteering to make this happen. And now the the next level of discussions begin about what next, what happens, what do we do, and that's going to be exciting. It's going
It,
to be a
it,
public process, I think,
hmm
but but I think it's going to be powerful.
I think so, and that was actually my final question. What's next? Meaning, will there be more search? I'm extremely interested in what the National Geographic finds from the forensic DNA of the wood of remnants of the ship that that we've found thus far, and just hearing those stories become alive of the 110 people that were on that ship. I think it's just going to be a fascinating story. So Jim, I know we're at the end of our time, but I wanted to thank you um, for following up, for agreeing to do this interview, and essentially, when we first met, you said that you would follow up and you would keep us in the loop. So thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. By the way, one last thought
Yes,
is
sir.
sometimes all you have to do is dig in the archives. Something we found in the notes of Captain Foster was very sad and chilling. 110 people went on board Clotilda, and only 109 were landed.
Made it.
One person,
Correct.
one person died, and one of the notes suggests that it was a 16-year-old woman. And so, again, she may not have a name written down by him. I'm sure that people on the boat may very well have known her. Some did at least, because so many strangers had been captured and brought together to be enslaved. But we mentioned this in the report and we call it out because ultimately, as was said from the get go, we find things and we study things because they provide us the means to talk about and learn more about and share the stories of people. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Jim, and look forward to seeing you all at the May 30th in
Absolutely.
Africa
I would
Town.
look forward to seeing you there.
So thank you guys, and I hope you have a great holiday weekend, Jim. Thank you for your time.
You, you bet. You
Thanks.
too. Take care.
Bye.